Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. I had so much fun listening to your talks. You can look at my tweet stream and see what I had to say. I had to say a lot, and I have a lot of questions for you. What I'm going to talk about today is food, innovation, and intellectual property rights. Oh, and is there a timer somewhere where I can see? It doesn't look like the clock is up here anymore.
If you go over, we won't cut you off.
Okay. Well, you guys can tell me to shut up when you're ready to no longer hear anymore. We've had a project at the Norman Lear Center, where I am based at the University of Southern California, for about 10 years now, actually, looking at creativity, commerce, and culture. And in particular, we were interested in how intellectual property law can help or hinder creatives in several different creative industries. We held a conference right around the time of the Napster crisis with the music industry and the film industry to talk about the ethical obligations of authors, what kind of copying is appropriate within a digital remix culture, and what the future might hold. And one thing we decided was that we really wanted to take a look at some industries that didn't have a lot of intellectual property protection, because the big problem in music, for instance, is that they had been monetizing their content by depending upon the control of copies. They're using copyright to make money. And it was as if they didn't have copyright protection anymore. People were just making copies of their music all the time. So we thought, well, what industries are out there that don't have much copyright protection over their designs? And oddly enough, automobiles, although they have a very distinctive look and feel, they cannot copyright that distinctive look and feel, no matter how crazy they might look. The same is true of furniture. Because it's a utilitarian object, you can't copyright it. It's not supposedly a piece of art. The same is true, actually, of computer databases. You can't own the copyright on the code for most databases. It's usually denied. In the open source community, such as Linux, you find that these very creative programmers actually opted out of the copyright regime so that programmers from all over the world could improve the code without asking permission. Similar in the tattoo industry. They actually have copyright protection for the two-dimensional designs that they've come up with, but it's just not cool to sue other tattoo artists if you're a tattoo artist, right? So you share your designs. If somebody outside of your community steals your design, that's another matter. Food. You cannot copyright the look and feel of a very distinctive dish, nor is there any copyright protection for recipes. Magic tricks, no copyright protection. The rules of games, also no copyright protection. You can literally sell and market a game that's based exactly on Parcheesi or Monopoly. You just can't use the same two-dimensional design of the board. Hairstyles. Celebrities do not collect royalties on their hairdos. Comics. Jokes cannot be copyright protected. So there's a self-policing within that community among comics that you don't steal another person's jokes. Fireworks displays. No matter how much time and effort and energy goes into this display, the only person who owns any copyright in this era here, in this arena, is the photographer. Perfume. You can patent the chemical formula that results in the scent of Chanel No. 5, for instance. But if you go to the mall, you've probably noticed there are all these knockoff scents that smell the same, smell alike. Well, that's legal because what you can't copyright is the aroma. And that's all that the consumer really cares about. They don't care what chemical formula you came up with. So knockoffs are perfectly legal. And that's why you see so many knockoffs in the fashion arena. Fashion designers do not own the three-dimensional design that they create. Any outfit that anybody is wearing in this room can be stolen, basically, replicated and copied by another fashion designer and passed off as their own. Now, some of these industries are sort of minor and marginal, but if you take a look at food and automobiles and fashion and furniture, obviously these are huge sectors of our economy. There's a tremendous amount of creative work that's being done there, and they have very little copyright protection over what they create. But the high IP industries that are really in crisis right now, they're actually a very tiny part of this sort of part of our world. So it's interesting, it seemed to us, that these very large industries were managing to function and being very innovative and very creative without ownership of their designs. We decided to focus on the fashion industry. We did a case study, a conference. If you go to readytoshare.org, you'll see video and transcripts and research that we commissioned. And it turned out that most people did not realize that fashion designers have very little intellectual property protection over what they create. What they really have and what they cling to is trademark protection. This is what they own. This is what another fashion designer cannot copy. And it makes sense. Consumers want to know the source of a product. And when these labels are in these garments, they should indicate that they come from these designers. That's one reason that you see designers placing logos on the exterior of their products, making the logo an iterated design, something that would make it harder for a knockoff artist to knock off, because it would be illegal. But if you go to Canal Street in New York, or to certain streets in China and Los Angeles, you'll see these very bizarre variations on logos. These are efforts to try to get around the fact that they can't make an exact copy of a trademark. Now, the reason that this is the case is the courts decided long ago that fashion designs are simply too utilitarian for copyright protection. Copyright is supposed to be for artistic objects. One thing that the courts were concerned about, and this is generally the case all around the world, is that some designer, some random designer, would own some key element of fashion design. Somebody would own this collar, somebody would own this cuff, somebody would own the A-line skirt, and that would mean that every designer to come later would have to actually go through some sort of legal licensing process in order to use that dress or that collar or cuff. But what seems strange to us, I think, is that we do not associate the term utilitarian with fashion. We think of fashion as frivolous, something unnecessary, something quite artful. And also, for those of you who are familiar with the standard justification for why it is that we have an intellectual property system and copyright, that is, without ownership, there is no incentive to innovate, we'll be a little confused, I think, by what happens in the fashion industry, in the food industry, furniture industry. They've managed to be very innovative without owning what they've created. And I'd like to argue that the fact that they don't have copyright protection within these worlds has actually allowed them to elevate what could have been just a utilitarian object to cover our nakedness into objects of art. Almost all of these images are images of fashion designs that have been collected at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. What happens when you don't have copyright protection is that there's the possibility for a very open creative process. You don't have to talk to a lawyer in order to sample from your peers' designs. You can sort of take from everywhere. This is one reason we have trends. People often ask me, how did trends develop? This is such a strange thing. Well, it's partly because it's legal to copy other people. And we all know that there are some very powerful figures within the fashion industry who have a kind of dictatorial power, it would seem, to dictate trends. But if you talk to any designers, the highest level, lowest level, they will admit to you that it is essential that they remain connected to the street, to real people, how they're wearing clothes. In the fashion world, things are not just top-down, it's very much bottom-up as well. I'm sure you're quite familiar with the fast fashion industry. It really was born here in Europe, and it's the portion of the fashion industry that's taking most obvious advantage of this lack of copyright protection. They sort of parasitically feed on higher-end designers who come up with fabulous designs that people want, and they knock it off at a cheaper price point. But in the United States and here in the EU as well, you see very few lawsuits, successful lawsuits, by top designers who claim that they're being economically harmed by fast fashion. They have not been able to prove that harm. But when you look at the copies, here's one that costs $1,000 from Givenchy, and here's a version that costs $200, and it's virtually identical. You have to wonder, why hasn't the fast fashion industry and knockoffs destroyed the high-end industry? Why would you pay $1,000 when you could only get away with paying $200? Well, this is one reason we held a conference at the University of Southern California. We invited people from all kinds of creative industries, but mostly from the fashion industry. This is Tom Ford. He had just stepped down as creative director at Gucci, and we asked him exactly this question. Why hasn't copying destroyed the fashion industry, the high end of the industry? And hopefully we'll have audio.
After much research that actually, not much research, quite simple research, that the counterfeit customer was not our customer.
So he was saying, well, we did some research. Well, it didn't really take much research. And we discovered that the people who were buying the knockoffs on Canal Street or in the cheap part of town were not the same people who were going into the Gucci boutique on Fifth Avenue. And later on in our conversation, he talked about the fact, really, that the brand had become much more global and much bigger because lower-end designers were knocking off his very popular designs. It was sort of like a gateway drug. People would get a knockoff of a Gucci bag or a knockoff of a Gucci gown, and then they would want the real thing. So even a creative director at a high-end luxury firm found that the fast fashion industry was actually not hurting his business, it was helping it, and that it wasn't cannibalizing from his customer base, it was actually increasing it. So in the culinary industry, the professional food industry, the restaurant industry, you also find some very similar analogous dynamics to what you see in the fashion industry, and I'll go through a few examples here. For instance, you can sample from the entire history of culinary knowledge. Recipes cannot be copyright protected. That means anyone in their home and a professional chef can go through the troves of history and take exactly what he or she wants. This is not the case in the music industry, nor the film industry. Trends develop as well in the culinary industry because it's legal to copy one another and to latch onto ideas that seem to resonate in the moment. You can't even open a menu in the United States anymore without seeing pork belly, something that never appeared on those menus 5 years ago. This is a result of a trend that's developed. And just like in the fashion industry, there are these giants in the field who seem to dictate trends, who have a tremendous kind of power over what the press says is in vogue and what we believe tastes good. There are also critics that play a very key role in this determination. These are the equivalent of Vogue magazine for the fashion industry. But you cannot deny that the street also has a huge impact on what it is people are eating and what it is that it inspires even chefs at the highest level. You often hear them talking about grandma's cooking, the street food they had when they were a kid. Food is very nostalgic, and it's by no means a top-down industry exclusively. And this is an example that sort of makes this literal. This is a restaurant that's just a few blocks away from my home in Los Angeles. Susan Feniger is a well-respected chef who has gone around the world and collected examples of excellent street food that she loves. And now she does high-end versions of street food in her restaurant. That's its specialty. So this is a sort of literal kind of example of how it is that the street and high-end cuisine interact with one another in a very seamless process, partly because there's no lawyers to talk to, no copyright protection pursued. And the fast food industry some might think of as a kind of parallel to the fast fashion industry for fashion designers. It's a thorn in the side. And here, in food, it's not because fast food is knocking off the recipes of high-end designers, but instead they are siphoning off huge portions of local populations who are getting cheap food that are at prices that local family restaurants can't compete against. But if you're looking for some sort of silver lining, it would be that those small family-run businesses have to try harder to serve something that is tastier and worth more money than what you can get at a McDonald's. I highly recommend this book by Johanna Benkler. He is a professor at Harvard University who's done a lot of research on this sort of counterintuitive notion that if you don't own something, you might be able to be more innovative. He's focusing more on technology and open source, but I think a lot of the lessons that he outlines in this book would help explain the innovative process in industries like cuisine and fashion. And in fact, there are quite a few virtues we can point to having very little protection and ownership. I think people forget that ownership is a double-edged sword. Yes, it's nice to own your own content and to be able to control it, but that means that everybody else owns their content and they're going to control theirs. And so you will have less access to other people's materials if you have exclusive rights to your own. When an entire history of creativity and design, the history of recipes, the history of fashion design, is open and available and unowned by anyone, it's a very sort of, there are democratic possibilities here. There's a very low barrier to entry. You do not have to pay a bunch of lawyers in order to start using designs from the past. They're free for all. They're in the public domain. And we all know that in fashion and in food, the new hot thing is rarely brand new. It's quite often something that is cherry-picked from the past. Some flavor, some taste, some color, a bell-bottom jean, whatever it is. And it is the genius of the chef and the fashion designer to look through the history of creativity and to select that one element and say, this is fresh and new now. And if you're interested in maintaining a cultural heritage, I think it's pretty logical to assume that if there is not a lot of copyright barbed wire around these materials, it makes it easier for these recipes, these designs to live on and to be accessible by everyone. Of course, this kind of culture of copying that develops has a huge impact on the creative process. And a lot of designers, a lot of chefs are very frustrated, of course. People steal from them. Stuart Weitzman is a very popular American designer, very successful. He complains a lot about knockoff artists. But I read this interview with him where he admitted that the only reason he came up with this innovative Bowden heel design is because he was trying to make a shoe that cheaper manufacturers would not be able to copy. You have to use something like steel or titanium to make this shoe. If you use a cheap plastic, it'll just crack. So these are the kinds of shoes that he used to make as prototypes just to get his design team excited in the way that the automotive industry makes prototypes to get their design team excited. But the competition was so fierce out there, he had to make this marketable to sell. It forced him to be more innovative. Certainly, in cuisine, you see the same drive, this desperate attempt to remain relevant, to do something interesting and new, to surprise people's senses. Farhan has gone to the greatest lengths to do exactly this. It's exhausting, but it's incredibly beneficial to the consumer. And this reminded me, actually, of a story I'd heard about Charlie Parker, the jazz genius. He was furious that white jazz musicians were always copying his work, and he claimed that that's why he invented bebop, what you're listening to right now. He was convinced that white musicians would be incapable of playing it. He wanted to make something that was simply too difficult to copy. But just because you can copy in the fashion industry, in cuisine, it's not necessarily okay to do so. If Prada were to trot out a collection that looked exactly like Karl Lagerfeld's from Chanel, she'd be laughed off the stage. It's essential that you develop a sort of signature style, right? A cohesion, an aesthetic vision, so that if somebody else steals what you're doing, everybody knows. They'll say, ah, that's Alexander McQueen. So in fashion design, there's this very powerful incentive to be unique and to find your own voice, because people are going to steal from you. You see a very similar dynamic in comedy, because anybody can steal a joke. There's a self-policing in the community, it's reputation-based, and you find comedians who try to come up with very, very distinctive material and distinctive personae, so that when their jokes are stolen, you can tell it's not that other person's joke. It's very similar in cuisine. If somebody is to offer a dignified diner a liquefied olive at a nice restaurant and not say that it was invented by Ferran, that diner will be horrified. What an embarrassment, a shame. You have to attribute, you have to acknowledge your source, even though you're not legally required to do so. Now, the other way that fashion designers have managed to cope with this culture of copying is that they realize, if you can't fight them, join them. So they have joined forces with large retailers and made copies of their own lines at much cheaper price points. And it's been a huge boon for their business. It's a way of expanding their clientele, of marketing their brand. I don't know if you've heard about what's happened with Missoni at Target. Unbelievable. All the servers were crashed, and I've been waiting for Missoni to do a partnership with Target for years now. I thought it was a perfect match, perfect aesthetic match. So incredibly popular, everything was sold out immediately, and now it's being sold on eBay at exponentially higher prices. And now Missoni probably is not going to be able to keep in stock any of their high-end luxury designs. And this is because they didn't try to fight them, they joined them. You see similar dynamics in the culinary industry, where chefs will develop very specific personal brands. They'll develop a trademark, and they will start marketing goods at lower price points. And this kind of makes sense to me, this dynamic, this dependence on authenticity, brand, trademark, the source, reputation. These words have come up over and over and over again in the last 2 days, because what we're talking about is a taste industry. There's no necessary right or wrong. Everything is determined by taste in the fashion industry and in culinary design. And so what we want as confused consumers and eaters in the marketplace is an expert, somebody to tell us, somebody we respect, to tell us this is good, this is beautiful, and this is tasty. And you don't have to, if you disagree with them, you follow somebody else. But many of us have decided that Ferran knows better than we do, and he can teach us something. And that name, that trademark, means something. And since he doesn't own the copyright on any of his recipes, this is a very powerful thing for him to own. So, once I started doing research on all of these supposed so-called low IP industries, industries with low levels of intellectual property protection, it made me wonder, what is the underlying logic for copyright protection? And it was very hard to find any sort of usable guideline. And this is definitely geared toward the system in the United States, but it's very much in accordance with what you'd find in the World Intellectual Property Organization as well. So this is probably the case in your country too. There is basically two binary oppositions at play when you're trying to determine what deserves copyright protection. The first is whether something is an artistic object or whether it's a utilitarian object. This, of course, is a very difficult question when you talk about food or fashion or any kind of applied design. So that's one of the oppositions, already difficult and contentious. The other one is whether something is an idea and should therefore be circulated freely in a free society. Imagine if somebody had a copyright on an idea and you were unable to think it. That would be a problem. Opposed to a physically fixed expression of an idea. For instance, a book, an article, a song, some physically fixed instantiation of an idea that anybody could otherwise have. People should own this for some period of time, according to copyright. What I think is one of the key sort of destabilizing factors in the world now is that digital technology, which makes it so easy for us to make copies of things, has kind of undermined our common sense notion of what things are physically fixed expressions. We have a hard time imagining a digital file as a physically fixed expression. Okay. A song or an album had a sort of material physicality that we recognized, a VHS tape, a CD, a film reel. But when these things became digital, it became harder, generally, for people to fathom them as objects that should not be copied. And so we're living in an era where copyright protection seems to be out of sync with our notions of what creative objects really are. Now, at the Norman Lear Center, we think this is one of the key questions of our age, because if you're trying to incentivize innovation within any field of human endeavor, you have to take a close look at ownership rights, and you can't necessarily presume that strong ownership is going to lead to the most innovation. And so I think that the cuisine industry and the fashion industry might offer other industries that are failing right now some really interesting lessons that they might need to follow. If you'd like more information about this subject, you can take a look at our website. It's readytoshare.org. And I wanted to thank my colleague, Veronica Hodicki, for making this beautiful presentation. Okay, thank you.
We have time for a few questions. While somebody is thinking about asking a question, I'll ask you a quick one.
Okay.
So it's ready to share from ready to wear?
Yes.
Okay.
Very clever now.
Yes. Are there no questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Can I?
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
of course.
Okay, I really enjoyed very much your presentation and the way that you look at this type of context, right? There's one thing that I've been just pondering for a while. With this strange two dynamics that you were mentioning. On the one side, you have the open law protection, the possibility that it's more democratic to open up innovation, and let's say on the other side, you have the race of the guru, right? So in a way, you have a process that should be open and that should, as democracy goes, it should enhance or facilitate a kind of dialogue, or really just to get some kind of consensus or final conclusion because of rational dialogue. And let's not go into Jürgen Habermas's idea, but this idea of having a kind of arena of discussion. And then in the end, it's a question of taste, and people, let's say, surrender rationality to the guru's lead in a way. So how you reconcile these two aspects?
Well, I think there are always going to be fashion victims, just as there are always going to be people who are, willing to follow the gurus, as you put it, and not necessarily contribute anything to the discussion or innovate in any way. And I think that's one of the complaints about the fast fashion industry, is that they're not contributing enough, considering the size of the sector of that industry. But I think it's a different sort of dynamic that's happening there, and it's something that I saw in a recent report from Rio. Rio de Janeiro just commissioned this huge report to look at their fashion industry there. The city is booming, and they wanted to figure out a better way to sort of monetize and trademark and brand the carioca lifestyle. You know, it's sexy, it's sensual, it's bright colors, but nobody is operating under any sort of meaningful umbrella. And there are several layers of the industry, including a big knockoff industry that is just stealing ideas from the core industry that spends a lot of money on research in the way that El Bulli spent all this money and time on research, and then other people would just steal the end product and market it as Carioca design. And what they found actually is that it wasn't as simple as that. Even fast fashion retailers like H&M, for instance, they are premier knockoff artists, but they actually do a lot of alterations of the original high-end designs in order to make them marketable to their distinctive audience, which has much less money. And the same is true of Zara, who has a very small team of designers, actually. I think Pablo Rodriguez just met with them. There was like 4 designers who decide on a day-by-day basis what to steal from other designers. And that is a very ingenious sort of process. Yes, it's parasitic and you know, you're just taking from somebody else's ideas, but you're making very, very calculated and strategic judgments about which collar, which cuff, which length will work for their very, very, very large global audience. And so I think there's not necessarily enough respect in the world for this kind of curatorial spirit, this ability to select rather than to necessarily create from anew. We need those people who jolt us and give us new ideas like Varan, but we also need the clever people who cherry pick.
Okay.
Okay, let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you very much.
So we have that coffee break now.